July 26th, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. The air hung thick with heat, coal smoke, and the bitter smell of burned oil drifting in from the ruined industrial shore. Even before dawn, the city seemed exhausted. What had once been one of the proud capitals of the empire now lay scarred and blackened, its factories broken, its neighborhoods flattened, its rail lines twisted under months of firebombing. In the naval district, men in white gloves and dark tunics moved in silence through corridors where every footstep seemed too loud. Clerks carried dispatches. Signal officers bent over fresh intercepts. Telephones rang, then stopped abruptly. Outside, the water of the bay reflected a pale sky, but there was no peace in it. Anchored vessels looked less like a fleet than the bones of one. Inside a conference room at the Navy Ministry, the admirals gathered under slow-turning fans that did little to cut the heat. Their uniforms were immaculate, but the men inside them carried the strain of defeat in every line of their faces. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy Minister, sat stiff-backed, fingers resting near a folder stamped with urgent markings. He had spent months watching the map of Japan contract under American pressure. He knew what Okinawa had revealed to anyone willing to see the truth. The United States no longer needed to guess how costly the final struggle would be. It had measured that cost in blood on beaches, in ships aflame under kamikaze attack, in Marines and soldiers clawing their way over ridges defended to the last man. And now, beyond Okinawa, there was only the home islands. Across from Yonai stood Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff. His jaw set hard, his expression severe. He had once commanded fleets across a broad ocean war. Now he presided over a navy that barely existed. Fuel was nearly gone. Trained pilots were scarce. Battleships sat idle for lack of movement orders they could carry out. Destroyers that should have screened convoys had been sunk months earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, built over decades with immense national pride, had been reduced to fragments, heroic memory, and desperate planning. Yet still the meetings continued, because the Americans had not yet landed on Kyushu or Honshu, and as long as they had not landed, some in Tokyo believed Japan could force a final bargain. A chart lay spread across the table. Southern Kyushu was marked in grease pencil. Beaches, roads, airfields, likely landing sectors. American staging areas in the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Estimated troop strength. Naval concentration. The work of staff officers had turned the future into colored arrows. Toyoda looked down at it and spoke in a low, clipped voice. "If they come here," he said, tapping the coast with one finger, "they will come with everything." No one answered at first. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Hundreds of ships, endless air cover, carrier groups, battleships, troop transports, landing craft in swarms so vast that the sea itself would appear armored. The Americans had learned every lesson of the Pacific War. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Leyte, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. They had paid for experience and kept it. By the summer of 1945, they could bring overwhelming force to a shoreline and sustain it. Japan could no longer match that force at sea, in the air, or in industry. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the special attack strategy, stood near the far end of the table, hollow-eyed and rigid. He had helped turn desperation into doctrine. Young aviators had been sent out in planes loaded with bombs and enough fuel for a one-way journey. They had crashed into destroyers, carriers, transports, at Okinawa. The attacks had shaken the American fleet and caused terrible casualties. But even Onishi understood the grim arithmetic. Suicide attacks could wound an invasion. They could not stop an empire with American production behind it. Still, for men like him, To admit that openly was to stare directly into the death of the state they had served all their lives. "The Navy cannot decide this battle at sea," Yonai said at last. It was a plain sentence, almost administrative in tone, but it landed harder than any shouted speech. A few officers lowered their eyes. Others remained motionless, as if discipline alone could keep the walls standing. Toyoda did not disagree. He only straightened and folded his hands behind his back. "Then the decision passes to the land," he said, "and to the spirit of the people." That phrase had become common in Tokyo by that stage of the war. The spirit of the people. It appeared in memos, briefings, speeches, and imperial discussions. It meant arming civilians with bamboo spears. It meant schoolgirls drilling with medical kits and explosives. It meant reservists and convalescents counted as defense forces on paper. It meant betting the nation on one final bloodletting so terrible that Washington might hesitate, negotiate, or fracture under the weight of casualties. Operation Ketsugo, the decisive homeland defense, rested on that hope. Yet among the admirals, beneath the formal phrases and ritual confidence, another understanding was spreading. Okinawa had shown not just American power, but Japanese limits. Tenacious defense had not saved the island. Mass sacrifice had not broken the enemy's will. The fleet had not intervened decisively. The air arm had burned itself out in waves of flame. If that same battle came to Kyushu on a greater scale, then the empire would not be preserved in victory. It would be consumed in place. Outside the windows, a launch moved slowly across Tokyo Bay, its wake spreading over still water. Far overhead, the sky remained empty for the moment, but every man in the room had learned to listen for engines. The folders were opened, reports were read, numbers were recited, aircraft available, fuel reserves, coastal batteries, training levels, civilian mobilization. Yet beneath every figure hung the same unspoken question when the Americans came ashore on Japan itself. What could an admiral honestly say? The reports kept coming through the final days of July like rain on a broken roof, each one adding weight to the same conclusion. American air power was no longer something glimpsed at the edges of the empire. It was overhead, offshore, and unavoidable. Railway yards vanished in smoke, ports were cratered, storehouses burned through the night. In naval offices from Tokyo to Kure, staff men unfolded situation maps and watched the red marks spread inward toward the heart of Japan. The admirals understood the pattern because they had once imposed similar patterns on others. Sea control first, air supremacy next, then isolation, then destruction. Now it was their country on the receiving end. Inside the underground chambers of the Naval General Staff, electric lights buzzed over long tables strewn with charts and dispatches. The room smelled of ink, damp concrete, and stale tobacco. Admiral Soemu Toyoda stood beside a wall map of Kyushu and the inland sea while younger officers waited with notebooks ready. Some of them were too young to remember the confidence of 1941 when the fleet had surged outward under banners of destiny. They had come of age in retreat, in rationing, in funeral notices, and in the endless effort to explain loss without using the word defeat. Toyoda's face seemed carved from stone. He spoke with the stern precision of a man holding together an institution already collapsing beneath him. The enemy will attempt to break the nation's will by combining bombardment, blockade, and landing operations, he said. The homeland must become the battlefield on which that will fails. The phrase was repeated in notes and memoranda, but those standing close enough could hear the fatigue under it. Toyoda was not a fool. He knew what remained of the Navy could not meet the Americans in a decisive surface action. There would be no second Tsushima, no dramatic fleet encounter restoring honor and strategic balance in a single blow. The combined fleet was a title more than a weapon now. What still floated was scattered, underfueled, and hunted from above whenever it moved. One of the staff officers stepped forward and indicated the coastal sectors most likely to receive the first invasion wave. Southern Kyushu, Ariake Bay, the beaches near Miyazaki, possible feints, secondary landings, airborne drops, naval bombardment zones. The projected American strength was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men once the operation matured. Vast stores of ammunition and armor. Carrier aviation in numbers no Japanese commander could meaningfully challenge. Silence settled after the briefing. It was broken not by Toyoda, but by Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, recently placed in command of the 5th Air Fleet in Kyushu. Ugaki was a hard believer, a man whose devotion to action had only sharpened as the war darkened around him. His diary mind was exacting, his outward posture disciplined, but inside him burned the conviction that sacrifice still had power. If the Navy can no longer strike in the old manner, Ugaki said, then it must strike in the only manner left to it. Everyone knew what he meant. Special attack, kamikaze, crash planes, explosive motorboats, suicide submarines, human torpedoes, every remaining instrument of self-destruction that could be turned against the approaching American armada. Some officers nodded immediately. Others kept their eyes on the table. The kamikaze campaign had inflicted real pain at Okinawa. Ships had sunk. Decks had become infernos. Sailors had died by the hundreds. The Americans had been shaken. Yet the invasion fleet had remained. The army had fought onshore alone until it was ground apart. Okinawa, from the Japanese side, had offered two truths at once. Special attacks could maul. They could not decide. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai arrived later that afternoon from a separate meeting with senior government figures. He removed his gloves slowly before taking his seat, as if postponing the words he knew he would have to say. Unlike some of the harder line officers around him, Yonai had long believed the war could not be won by continuing it. That did not make him soft. It made him one of the few men in power capable of counting beyond slogans. The Army requests further commitment from naval personnel for homeland defense, he said. Toyoda gave a small nod. That is already being considered. Yonai looked around the room. Then consider also the result. The words hung in the stale air. A rear admiral near the side wall shifted in his seat. Another cleared his throat, but said nothing. Yonai continued, his voice measured, almost gentle, which made the content more unsettling. Okinawa has shown us what they are willing to spend. It has shown us what we are willing to lose. If this battle is brought to Kyushu and then to the main island, the Navy will not preserve the nation. It will witness its destruction. No one challenged him directly. In these rooms, disagreement was often expressed through silence, posture, or the careful wording of later memoranda. But the emotional force of what he had said was unmistakable. Not preserve the nation, witness its destruction. It was the kind of sentence many had thought privately and almost none had dared state aloud. Ugaki's expression tightened. Destruction may be the cost of preserving the national polity. Yonai turned to him. A polity without people, cities, shipping, or food is a phrase, not a state. That was as sharp as naval conversation generally became in such circles. No shouting, no pounding fists, just rank, exhaustion, and two visions of duty crashing together behind controlled voices. One held that sacrifice on a colossal scale might still force political space. The other held that the sacrifice itself would erase the very thing it claimed to defend. Outside the room, clerks hurried between offices carrying transcripts of the Potsdam Declaration. The Allies were calling for Japan's surrender. Within the upper reaches of government, the language was being parsed, resisted, reconsidered, and buried beneath arguments over honor, imperial sovereignty, and fear of occupation. In the Navy, reactions were divided, but many admirals saw more clearly than they admitted. Their service had always been the most exposed to material reality. Ships required steel, fuel, training, logistics, dockyards, escort routes, repair capacity. Naval officers could not live entirely on rhetoric. A ship either sailed or it did not. An air group either launched or remained grounded. A convoy either arrived or was sunk. And so, by the time discussions turned once more to an American invasion of the home islands, several admirals had reached a grim clarity. They did not all say it in the same words. Some spoke of the impossibility of prolonged resistance. Some warned that the decisive battle doctrine had become fantasy. Some still wrapped their doubts in formal calls for honorable struggle. But beneath the language, there was a common recognition. Military means could no longer secure national survival. As dusk settled over Tokyo, a siren rose somewhere above the government district. Thin at first, then stronger, cutting through concrete halls and paper screens. Officers paused only briefly before continuing their work. That was how they lived now, between alarms and meetings, between collapse and procedure. On the table before Yonai lay a penciled note summarizing expected casualties if the Americans landed in force. It contained no poetry, no ideology, no comfort, only figures. Army dead, civilian dead, naval losses, shipping losses, urban ruin, famine risk, administrative disintegration. He looked at it for a long moment, then closed the folder with his palm. There were still men in Tokyo who spoke of final victory. There were still those who imagined one terrible battle might redeem all previous defeats. But among the admirals who had watched the Pacific War from the bridge, the chart room, and the operations office, illusion was beginning to crack. They had commanded fleets across thousands of miles. They had studied America's industrial tempo, its shipbuilding, its pilot training, its fuel reserves, its capacity to replace damage and return stronger. Now they looked at Japan and saw a nation almost out of ships, almost out of planes, almost out of time. And as plans for the defense of the sacred soil advanced, the most experienced among them began to understand that what awaited was not salvation through battle, but annihilation through obedience. The memory of Okinawa lay over every meeting like smoke that would not clear. It was there in the clipped tone of operations briefings, in the long pauses after casualty figures were read, in the way officers avoided each other's eyes when transport capacity or fuel reserves were discussed. No one in the upper reaches of the Navy could study the defense of the Ryukyus and come away untouched. The island had become a brutal test of every remaining Japanese assumption, if ferocity, endurance, and self-sacrifice could stop an American advance. Okinawa should have done it. If kamikaze attacks could break an invasion fleet beyond recovery, Okinawa should have done it. If terrain, weather, and bloodshed could buy time enough to alter strategic reality, Okinawa should have done it. But by June 1945, the island was gone. The fleet was weaker than before, and American forces stood one step from Japan itself. In a side office of the Naval Ministry, two captains waited while a clerk placed fresh reports on a low table. One was a veteran staff planner with wire-rimmed glasses and a face worn down by years of poor news delivered in formal language. The other had come recently from the southwest area, where he had watched the collapse of bases once described as vital outer defenses. Both men read in silence. Aircraft losses, shipping destroyed, replacement training levels, ammunition shortages, civilian evacuation delays. The numbers had a dead quality to them, as if they no longer described a living war but the administrative dismantling of one. At length the older captain said quietly, "Okinawa was the model." The younger officer did not answer. It was also the proof. The younger man looked up. He knew what was meant. Okinawa had been treated by both Army and Navy as a rehearsal for the homeland struggle, a place where the Americans would be forced to pay such a frightful price that future operations might be delayed or politically constrained. Yet from another angle, one far harder to admit, the island had also proven that the decisive homeland battle could not achieve what its advocates claimed. Even under conditions favorable to defense, with caves, ridges, prepared positions, and massed special attacks, the Americans had endured. They had been hurt, badly at times, but not broken. Later that day, in a broader discussion among senior naval officers, the battle was reviewed once more. Admiral Soemu Toyoda stood at the head of the room as maps of Okinawa and southern Kyushu were placed side by side. The comparison was obvious and devastating. One island had already shown what the next campaign would look like, only smaller. Naval bombardment from offshore, continuous air attack, destruction of infrastructure before the main landings, then the assault itself, with reserves brought in behind a shield of sea and air supremacy. A staff officer, his voice precise despite the strain around his eyes, summarized the American pattern. They isolate the objective, reduce transportation, destroy communications, interdict reinforcement, and land when resistance has been degraded but not eliminated. They accept casualties where necessary, but always with replacement capacity intact. Toyoda listened without interruption. The language was clinical, but every man in the room could translate it into images. Ships burning at anchor, roads littered with dead horses and shattered carts, telephone lines down, hospitals overflowing, children moving with evacuation columns past bombed stations. Farm fields turned into airstrips or graveyards. A homeland invasion would not be a single climactic clash. It would be a prolonged tearing apart of the national body. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi entered midway through the session, his posture rigid, his expression drawn tighter than ever. He had carried the burden of the special attack arm so long that it seemed to have hollowed him from within. Many younger officers still revered him. Others feared him. Some pitied him. He took his seat and listened to the casualty projections for the expected American landings on Kyushu. When the briefing ended, he spoke in a voice roughened by fatigue. If we can destroy enough transports before the enemy secures his beachhead, the invasion timetable may collapse. It was not an unreasonable military thought on its own terms. Destroy transports, create chaos, separate assault units from supplies, force delay. In another war, under other circumstances, it might have been part of a workable defensive concept, but here the scale was impossible. American shipbuilding had already replaced losses that would have crippled most navies on Earth. New carriers joined the fleet while damaged ones returned from repair. Landing craft seemed to multiply. Escort screens thickened. Radar improved. Combat air patrols adapted. Every Japanese officer in the room knew it. Yonai answered with care, because Onishi was both respected and fragile in ways few said aloud. How many is enough? No one moved. Onishi did not reply immediately. His eyes remained on the map, on the coastlines marked for blood. How many? Yonai repeated, more softly. The room understood the cruelty of the question. It was not rhetorical. It was arithmetic. How many transports would have to burn? How many destroyers sink? How many carrier decks be struck? How many American dead would force a halt, and how many Japanese pilots, boats, submarines, aircraft, and civilians would be expended in the attempt? Okinawa had already suggested the answer. The number required was beyond what Japan could still inflict. Onishi exhaled and looked down. More than we can guarantee. There it was, spoken at last in the language of a soldier who could no longer hide behind hope. More than we can guarantee. For a moment, the conference room seemed to narrow around that admission. No one wrote it down, but all of them heard it. Outside, Summer rain began to strike the windows in hard bursts. In the hallway, naval aides moved quickly under the dim bulbs, carrying folders between rooms where parallel arguments unfolded across the state. The army still pushed for total resistance. Hardliners in government still spoke of one decisive national convulsion that would preserve honor and possibly improve surrender terms if surrender came at all. But among many naval leaders, especially those who had followed logistics and attrition closely, the vocabulary was changing. They still spoke of duty. They still prepared defense plans. They still signed mobilization orders. Yet under the official phrases, another set of words appeared more often in private exchanges: impossible, exhausted, unsustainable, ruin. One rear admiral, speaking that evening to a small circle of subordinates over weak tea in a darkened office, said what many senior men had started to think. The army speaks of battle as if battle itself were a solution. For us, battle is now only a form of ending. The younger officers looked at him carefully, unsure whether they had heard something dangerously close to defeatism. But the rear admiral continued, "We have no fleet reserve worth naming, no fuel to maneuver freely, limited pilot training, ports under attack, industry collapsing, food transport failing. Even if the enemy suffers terribly, we do not emerge preserved. We emerge emptied." That word stayed with them. Emptied. It described more than military weakness. It described a civilization bled of motion, choice, and future. As the night deepened, Tokyo remained under threat of air attack, and the men of the Navy kept working by shaded lamps, drafting orders for units that barely existed and contingency plans for weapons few believed that would be decisive. Yet their private conversations grew more candid. Some wondered whether insisting on a final homeland battle was becoming less an act of strategy than a refusal to speak the truth before the emperor. Others feared that even discussing peace too openly would bring accusations of cowardice or treason. Many lived in that space between knowledge and obedience, where understanding the disaster ahead did not free them from helping prepare it. In those days, what Japanese admirals said was often cautious, coded, wrapped in institutional language. They did not usually declare flatly that the war was lost. They spoke instead of the limits of endurance, of the absence of material means, of the need to preserve the kokutai, of the unbearable costs certain courses would impose. But listen closely enough, and the meaning was clear. Okinawa had shown them the future. An American landing on the home islands would not defend Japan from destruction. It would bring destruction ashore and make every surviving admiral a witness to the death of the empire he had sworn to serve. August 1945 approached under a sky that seemed never fully clear. Even when the sun broke through over the naval districts, it fell on wreckage, shortages, and men carrying on by routine because routine was the last structure still standing. In offices near the Imperial Palace, in bunker rooms beneath Tokyo, in surviving headquarters at Kure and Yokosuka, admirals and their staffs continued to refine plans for a battle many no longer believed could preserve the nation. Yet they kept planning because the machinery of the state still demanded action, and because no officer of their rank could simply step outside history and refuse his place in it. The maps of Kyushu had become familiar enough to haunt sleep. Ariake Bay, Kagoshima, Miyazaki, inland roads suitable for moving reserves, areas where anti-landing guns might still function after bombardment, hidden strips where remaining aircraft could be launched for special attacks, coves where explosive motorboats might wait beneath camouflage nets. Each mark on the paper represented an idea of resistance. Each idea rested on assumptions that were growing thinner by the day. At a strategy session attended by senior naval officers and liaison representatives from the Army, the discussion turned once more to the logic of Operation Ketsugo. An Army general, his voice firm despite the dark rings under his eyes, argued that the enemy must be met with such violence upon landing that American political leaders would reconsider the cost of total conquest. Casualties, he insisted, were now the essential weapon. Not territory, not sea power, not air parity. Pain. Several admirals listened in silence. They had heard variations of the argument for months. It had become the central creed of those still insisting that military resistance could alter the endgame. If Japan could no longer win in the conventional sense, then perhaps it could make victory so expensive that the enemy would accept terms short of unconditional surrender. When the general finished, Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai folded his hands and asked a question with almost polite detachment. And after Kyushu, the army representative stared at him for a moment. "We bleed them there," he replied. "Then we continue the struggle." Yonai did not raise his voice. With what shipping, with what fuel, with what cities intact, with what food distribution, with what trained formations after the first losses? No one in the room could dismiss those questions. They were not abstract. Naval officers especially had spent the last year measuring collapse in tonnage and barrels, in convoy sinkings, in rail disruption, in repair yards left burning after air raids. They understood that war was not only fought by courage, it was sustained by movement, supply, maintenance, and time. Japan was losing all four. Admiral Soemu Toyoda remained more publicly committed to resistance than Yonai, but even he had begun to speak in ways that revealed the depth of the crisis. In private discussions with staff officers, he no longer described the decisive battle as a path to victory. He described it as an unavoidable national trial, one that might preserve some remnant of political dignity if endured with sufficient severity. It was a subtle but important shift. Victory had faded from the vocabulary. Endurance had taken its place. That evening, in a more restricted conference within the Naval General Staff, a senior planning officer summarized the Navy's remaining offensive capacity for the homeland defense. The figures were exact and grim. A certain number of aircraft, though many were obsolete or suitable only for one-way missions. Small craft prepared for suicide attack. Pockets of ammunition. Scattered anti-aircraft defenses. Limited submarine potential. Surface units too precious or too immobile to risk freely. Fuel so scarce that operational freedom had become a memory. After the briefing, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki spoke with characteristic intensity. "If the fleet cannot maneuver, then the air must become the fleet. Every machine capable of flight must be sent against the invasion shipping." His words carried force because no one doubted his sincerity. Ugaki believed in striking until nothing remained. Yet by then, even officers inclined toward hard resistance could hear the weakness beneath the determination. Every machine capable of flight. That was not the language of strategic depth. It was the language of total expenditure. One commander from naval aviation, a man who had spent weeks inspecting airfields hidden among groves and hills, answered carefully, "We can launch them. Many will not reach the target. Those that do may inflict damage, but they will not remove the enemy from the sea." Ugaki turned sharply toward him. Damage at the right moment can become decision. The aviation commander held his ground. "At Okinawa, we inflicted damage. The enemy remained." There was no insult in the sentence, only memory. Okinawa remained the shadow behind every plan. The Americans had absorbed losses, adapted, and kept advancing. Their wounded fleet had not withdrawn beyond recovery. Their carriers had not vanished. Their transport system had not broken. Instead, they had tightened air cover, improved picket lines, refined radar control, and continued to deliver men and material ashore. A homeland invasion would come with even greater preparation. Later, after the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, two admirals stood near a shuttered window overlooking a courtyard darkened by blackout rules. One of them had served long enough to remember the optimism before Pearl Harbor, before Midway, before Guadalcanal had turned confidence into attrition. The other had built his career in staff work, where optimism had long ago been replaced by ledgers of loss. The younger men still ask whether we can stop them on the beaches. The first admiral said, "And what do you tell them?" the second asked. The older man took a slow breath. "I tell them to do their duty." The second admiral nodded once. "And to yourself?" The answer came after a long pause. "To myself. I say we cannot stop them, only kill many before we are swept aside." That was perhaps the most honest thing an admiral of Imperial Japan could say in those last weeks without openly crossing into defiance. The aim had narrowed from victory to delay, from preservation to punishment, from strategic hope to sacrificial intent. Many officers still clothed that reality in formal language about imperial destiny and national essence. But inside the Navy, where men understood the concrete limits of a modern maritime war, illusion had worn thin. The private words of the admirals grew heavier as the strategic picture darkened. They spoke of preserving the throne, not of defeating the United States. They spoke of avoiding utter national dismemberment, not of regaining the initiative. They spoke of making the enemy pay, not of throwing him back into the Pacific. This was more than rhetoric. It was the sound of a command elite shrinking its ambitions because reality had already stripped away the rest. One admiral, in a confidential conversation recorded later by a subordinate, put it bluntly, the war can no longer be won by operations. It can only be concluded, and the manner of its conclusion will determine whether Japan survives in name or dies in flames while insisting on forms. That sentence circulated quietly, never as an official statement, never in a signed memorandum, but as the kind of remark repeated behind closed doors by men who sensed history closing around them, dies in flames while insisting on forms. It captured something essential about the late imperial command system. Procedure remained, meetings continued, orders were drafted, courtesies were observed. Yet beneath the structure, the substance had nearly vanished. And still, because no final political decision had yet been made, the admirals returned the next day to their maps, their casualty tables, and their impossible responsibilities. They discussed where to place remaining aircraft, how to coordinate with Army coastal defenses, which ports might still support emergency transport, how to protect what little fuel remained, how to communicate after bombardments severed cables and smashed radio sites. Their work was not meaningless. It was simply trapped inside a strategic dead end. They knew the Americans were gathering. They knew Okinawa had shown the cost. They knew military means could not save the nation. Yet until the state itself accepted that truth, the admirals could do only two things: prepare for catastrophe, and try in whatever words rank and loyalty allowed to make others understand that the coming invasion would not rescue Japan through battle. It would finish what the war had already begun. August 6th, 1945. Morning. Tokyo. The news did not arrive with full meaning at first. It came in fragments, in confused transmissions, in reports so strange that even men seasoned by years of catastrophe hesitated before accepting them. Hiroshima had been struck by a single bomb. Communications were broken, damage beyond expectation, fire on an unprecedented scale. Command channels stumbled as officers tried to separate rumor from measurable fact. In the Navy Ministry and the Naval General Staff, clerks ran messages from room to room while signal officers bent over fresh intercepts. Some assumed it was another massive incendiary raid. Others spoke of a new explosive. No one yet understood how complete the destruction was. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai read the preliminary summaries in silence. He had spent months warning, in careful language, that Japan stood at the edge of national annihilation if the war continued. Now something new had entered the equation, something that seemed to compress the entire strategic collapse into one blinding point. A city struck, a city erased, one aircraft, perhaps only a few. It was almost beyond military habit to think in such terms. Across the capital, senior naval officers were summoned again. The heat was oppressive. Sweat gathered beneath collars and cap bands. Ceiling fans stirred paper more effectively than air. On a side table stood glasses of water gone warm. The atmosphere in the room was not one of panic, but of tightening dread, the kind that settles when men already carrying one unbearable conclusion are handed another. Admiral Suemu Toyoda listened as technical officers tried to explain what little was known. A weapon of extraordinary blast effect. Intense heat. Vast urban destruction in an instant. Casualty estimates impossible. Communications from Hiroshima, intermittent or absent. One officer finished his report and looked down, unable to meet the eyes around him. Toyoda asked the essential question, can this be repeated? No one had a confident answer. If it could, then all previous calculations changed. Coastal defense, attritional resistance, the bloody arithmetic of an American landing. All of it still mattered. But it now existed beside the possibility that Japan's remaining cities might simply disappear one by one before the invasion even began. Naval men who had thought in terms of blockade and bombardment now had to imagine national disintegrations accelerated to a pace the old categories could not contain. Yonai spoke with unusual directness. If this weapon is what it appears to be, then the continuation of war becomes not merely hopeless, but catastrophic in a new form. No one challenged the logic. Even officers still committed to resistance understood the force of it. The Navy had already concluded, in many of its upper circles, that the home islands could not be saved by military means. Now the cost of refusing that truth seemed to be expanding beyond invasion and starvation into something even more immediate and less survivable. Then came August 8th. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. That blow landed differently, but no less heavily. For months, some in Tokyo had clung to the fantasy that Moscow might serve as an intermediary in negotiations. It had been one of the last diplomatic illusions available to men unwilling to surrender, yet unable to win. When the Soviets attacked, that illusion shattered. In naval offices, maps were spread again, not of Kyushu now, but of Manchuria, Sakhalin, the Kurils, and the northern approaches. The strategic encirclement felt complete. America from the sea and air, the Soviet Union from the continent and north. The empire had run out of directions in which to retreat. An admiral on Toyoda's staff said quietly to a colleague after the news was confirmed, "Now there is no interval left." It was a simple phrase, but it captured the mood exactly. No interval left for maneuver, no interval left for negotiation through postponement. No interval left for those who still hoped a single massive battle could somehow improve Japan's position before terms were accepted. On August 9th, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, a city with profound naval significance, home to shipbuilding, repair, and generations of maritime labor. For naval officers, the strike carried a special cruelty. This was not destruction at a remote frontier. This was destruction in one of the living organs of Japan's seaborne existence. The reports from Nagasaki deepened the silence in the high command. Men who had spent their adult lives in service to fleets and dockyards now confronted the possibility that even the remnants of national industrial life could be snuffed out before any invasion fleet appeared on the horizon. A homeland battle had once been imagined as the final proving ground of national will. Now the state itself seemed to be unraveling faster than such a battle could even begin. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, worn down almost to the bone, still resisted total acceptance. He remained convinced that sacrifice had meaning, that to stop fighting without extracting a price from the enemy would stain the nation forever. Yet even he could not ignore the combined shock of Hiroshima, the Soviet entry, and Nagasaki. The field of action had narrowed to almost nothing. In one tense discussion among senior naval leaders, the question was no longer whether Japan could win. That question had largely died. The question was whether further resistance served any rational military purpose at all. A staff admiral, speaking with unusual bluntness, put it plainly. If the Americans invade, we cannot stop them. If they continue these bombings, our cities vanish. If the Soviets advance, the empire fragments further. What military objective remains that justifies continuation? No one answered immediately because there was no easy answer. Honor was invoked. Duty was invoked. The imperial institution was invoked, but concrete military purpose, measurable and strategic, had become almost impossible to define. Yonai, who had long stood nearer the peace position than many around him, saw the opening and the danger together. He knew that facts alone did not end wars. Wars ended when facts were admitted by the political and military men who had spent years denying them. He pressed as far as loyalty and circumstance allowed. The Navy has done what it can, he said. It can no longer secure national survival through combat. Further destruction will not improve conditions. It will erase conditions. Erase conditions. Those words struck hard because they were not dramatic. They were administrative, almost cold, yet they described exactly what many admirals now feared. Not defeat alone. Erasure. The disappearance of the practical foundations on which any post-war Japan, however diminished, might still stand. Admiral Toyoda did not become a peace advocate in the same manner as Yonai, but the language around him also shifted. He still spoke of resistance, of duty to the throne, of readiness to fight if ordered. But beneath that formal adherence to military obligation lay a recognition impossible to miss. The decisive battle for the homeland was no longer a path to preservation. It was an instrument of total ruin if pursued beyond the point of political necessity in darkened rooms. After the formal conferences ended and only a handful of senior officers remained, the conversation grew more honest than the record often showed. They discussed famine, internal disorder, administrative collapse, the possibility that occupation terms might worsen, not improve, if Japan forced invasion while its cities continued to vanish under atomic attack. They no longer asked how to save the empire as it had been. They asked whether enough of Japan could still be saved to justify ending the war before the country was physically and socially shattered beyond repair. That was the heart of what many Japanese admirals said, whether openly or through guarded implication, when American forces prepared to invade Japan itself. By mid-August, after Okinawa, after the atomic bombs, after Soviet intervention, they understood that the military instrument had failed. It could still kill. It could still exact suffering. It could still stage one last convulsion of obedience and sacrifice. But it could not preserve the nation. And for men raised in the creed of service, that realization was almost unbearable. They had devoted their lives to power at sea, to doctrine, to command, to the belief that in the final test the Navy would help secure the empire's future. Instead, they found themselves saying, in one form or another, that further battle would not secure survival. It would only determine how much more of Japan would die before the inevitable end was spoken aloud. August 14th, 1945. Tokyo. Night. The city lay under blackout, but darkness no longer meant safety. It only made the ruins harder to see. In government buildings still standing amid the wreckage, the final arguments moved through corridors heavy with heat, fatigue, and the smell of old paper. Telephones clicked. Messengers hurried. Doors opened and closed on rooms where the fate of the empire was no longer being debated in terms of victory, but in terms of how much destruction would accompany the acknowledgement of defeat. For the admirals, this was the hour when thought, duty, and reality finally collided without the shelter of abstraction. The Americans were preparing to invade the home islands. Okinawa had revealed the scale of blood that would follow. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown that whole cities could now be destroyed in a single stroke. The Soviet Union had entered the war, stripping away the last diplomatic fantasy. Every strategic road left open led not to preservation through arms, but to greater devastation. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai moved through those final meetings with the bearing of a man who had long anticipated this moment and dreaded it all the same. He did not speak like a triumphant advocate proven right. There was nothing triumphant left in Tokyo. He spoke like a statesman trying to save from fire whatever beams had not yet collapsed. In conference, he stated the matter as plainly as rank and circumstance allowed. The continuations of war offers no prospect of success. It offers only the certainty of further destruction to the nation and grave danger to the imperial institution itself. This was the essential naval conclusion in its most disciplined form. Not a cry of despair, not a dramatic confession, a judgment, a cold one. The armed forces could continue to fight. Certainly, there were still planes to launch, boys to arm, civilians to mobilize, beaches to mine, and ships to sacrifice. But none of that fighting could restore strategic possibility. It could only deepen national ruin. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, bound by office and loyalty to maintain the posture of resistance unless ordered otherwise, remained more formal in tone. Yet even in formality, the truth had begun to show through. He no longer spoke as if decisive victory could emerge from the homeland battle. He spoke of fulfilling duty if battle came, but his language had lost the confidence of military solution. The distinction mattered. He was still a commander, still a servant of the state, still prepared to fight if commanded. But by now the highest levels of the Navy understood that obedience and strategic faith were no longer the same thing. In smaller rooms, beyond the polished phrases of official sessions, the admirals spoke more openly. One said the nation now stood at the point where ending the war was not shameful surrender, but necessary preservation. Another warned that an American landing, combined with atomic destruction and Soviet pressure, would shatter not only military resistance but civil order itself. A third observed that if Japan insisted on receiving the invasion on its own beaches, then millions who had no part in planning the war would be offered up to settle an argument already decided by industry. Fuel and time. These were not the words of men who had become pacifists overnight. They were still officers of Imperial Japan. They still thought in terms of honor, sacrifice, and loyalty to the throne. But they had reached the final professional truth of their careers. Naval power had limits. Courage had limits. National endurance had limits. And Japan had crossed them. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi faced that truth in his own terrible way. No figure embodied the agony of the Navy's last phase more sharply than the man who had championed organized suicide attack as a weapon of desperation. He had believed, or perhaps forced himself to believe, that enough willing death might still alter the enemy's calculations. But the end had come without the redemption that belief demanded. The Americans had not been hurled back. The empire had not been preserved by sacrifice. Young men had died in fire, and still the homeland stood defenseless before greater forces. In those final hours, Onishi reportedly expressed remorse for the lives expended in special attacks. Whether spoken formally, privately, or carried in the unbearable symbolism of what followed, the meaning was clear. The Navy's last great gamble of spirit against material power had failed. There would be no saving reversal, only reckoning elsewhere. Other admirals wrestled with a different burden. How to obey an emperor who would likely end the war while portions of the army still demanded continued struggle. How to maintain order during surrender. How to prevent fanatics from turning the final hours into civil bloodshed. The mission had changed almost at once. No longer preparing only for invasion, they were now preparing to ensure that the state could survive the act of stopping. That required a new kind of courage, quieter than battle and less celebrated in martial cultures. It meant accepting humiliation to prevent annihilation. It meant preserving institutions by ceasing to spend lives pointlessly in their name. It meant understanding that fidelity to Japan might now require silence where once it had required attack, restraint where once it had required fury. Near midnight, as the Emperor's decision moved toward implementation, the mood in naval circles was tense but altered. The central argument was ending. What remained was consequence. Some officers felt relief so deep it resembled numbness. Others felt disgrace. Many felt both. Around them, the city listened in darkness, uncertain what dawn would bring. When the final direction became clear, the admirals did not all react in the same way. Some accepted it as necessary. Some accepted it with bitterness. Some bowed to it because obedience left no honorable alternative. But the underlying assessment that had emerged through the summer remained constant. The invasion of Japan itself would not have been the defense of the nation. It would have been the scene of its final physical destruction. That is what Japanese admirals said. Directly or indirectly, when American forces prepared to invade the home islands, they said the Navy could no longer determine the war. They said Okinawa had exposed the cost. They said military means could not preserve national survival. They said that to continue without realistic hope was to sacrifice Japan to forms, phrases, and habits of obedience after strategy had already died. And in the last days, as atomic fire, Soviet attack, blockade, famine risk, and invasion planning converged, many of them came to the same conclusion. The duty of command was no longer to seek victory through battle. It was to prevent the complete obliteration of the country that battle could no longer save. By dawn, the empire they had served was still standing in name, but the world that had created it was over. The admirals had reached the end of the charted sea. Beyond it lay surrender, occupation, memory, and judgment. Behind them lay fleets sunk, cities burned, and a generation spent. Their final words were not those of conquerors or even of men who believed they could still decide events through force. They were the words of officers who had seen too clearly what the invasion of Japan would mean and understood, at last, that survival could no longer be won with weapons.